The story we've told so far of star birth has been basically the story of our sun, and the sun is unusual in that it seems to be a single star. Most stars are actually part of star systems because it turns out that most nebulae are big enough that they will actually collapse in more than one place at a time. And when they do that, they will produce not single stars, but multiple star systems, or what we call star clusters. So if they collapse in two or more places, then we get those multiple stars that we talked about earlier in the course. One example of that, if you remember the summer triangle, here's the summer triangle, and this is Deneb, and the the Northern Cross is in there, and down at the bottom of Deneb is a star called Albireo. Albireo is a binary star system, two different stars um, of two different temperatures and therefore two different colors. Absolutely beautiful in binoculars or a small telescope. Another example of a multiple star system that we looked at is, if you remember when we talked about the winter constellations, there's Orion's belt, Orion the hunter, and up above, the fight between Orion and Taurus the bull is being viewed by Gemini the twins, and the two stars of Gemini the twins, the two bright stars, are Pollux and Castor. And we mentioned Castor, the dimmer one, is actually a six-star system. This is what it would look like if you were close to that system, we think. And in fact, what happened here is that this nebula contracted in three different places, and then each of those three spots kind of split into two to form pairs of stars. So you have these three pairs of stars. And you can have multiple star systems up to maybe 7, 8, 9 stars. Now, if a very large nebula collapses in many places, in hundreds of places or more, then we get what's called a star cluster. There are two kinds of star clusters. Open clusters are found inside our galaxy. They're all relatively young. We can tell that because they still have a lot of their dust and gas in them. We still see star open clusters forming today. They're called open clusters because they're made up of maybe hundreds of stars, a few hundred stars, that don't have enough gravity to really pull the stars together. They're held together in a group, but with no particular shape because there aren't enough stars to generate enough gravity. The most famous open cluster, and we've already met this, is the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters in Taurus the Bull over here. And I showed you this again for the winter constellations. If you were to go and look at the Pleiades in a pair of binoculars, it looks like this. You'd see a few dozen stars. In a big professional telescope, it looks like this, and you can still see the material that these stars formed from. Another open cluster is called the Beehive cluster in Cancer. Another one is the double cluster in Perseus, NGC 869 and NGC 884. Now in the sky, these two are close to each other and they look like they're beside each other. They're really not. One's much further away than the other, but they're an absolutely gorgeous sight, and I had to include this picture where somebody photoshopped in an image of the double cluster to show us what it would look like if NGC 869 and 884 were much closer so that we could see them with the naked eye in our skies. The other kind of cluster is much bigger and much older. These globular clusters contain not hundreds of stars, but hundreds of thousands of stars, and they're very old. They're typically about 10 billion years old, so they date back to around the origin of our galaxy, and they're actually not inside the galaxy. They form this halo around our galaxy, and we no longer see these forming today. They're all very old stars, but there are so many of them that gravity actually pulls them towards each other to form a spherical shape, and that's where they get the name globular cluster. The most famous globular cluster is M13 in Hercules. This part of Hercules is um, an asterism called the keystone, and it forms the body of Hercules, the strong man. These are his armpits, and right near one of his armpits, if you were to look in a pair of binoculars, you would see this pale little smudge of light. But in a telescope, even a backyard telescope, that pale smudge of light resolves itself into countless stars. You couldn't really separate them all and count them. In a professional telescope, this is what this gorgeous globular cluster looks like. Here's another globular cluster, M53 in Coma Berenices, 47 Tucani, and the largest one is actually visible to the naked eye. It's called Omega Centauri. It's only visible, though, in the southern hemisphere. And in a telescope, this is what it looks like. Absolutely gorgeous. But these are all siblings. These are stars that all formed billions and billions and billions of years ago from a tremendously large nebula, the kind of nebulae that don't exist in our galaxy anymore. And they all started to collapse in these hundreds of thousands of places to form these hundreds of thousands of stars. So that's it for star birth. Next day, we will look at what happens to a star during its lifetime.